Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala, the lessons in cultural studies continuing with our next component, post-structuralism and cultural studies. This is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad, bringing you this lesson. Post-structuralism as a theoretical framework has emerged primarily from linguistics and philosophy and has been appropriated within cultural studies, literary studies and other cognate disciplines. Post-structuralism, as the word post seems to indicate, comes after structuralism. And this is a pointer in terms of time, but also in terms of how the philosophical process has evolved from the first stages and the writings of Jacques Derrida writing in the 1960s in French. The translations of these were instrumental in bringing post-structuralism into the English-speaking world. How does this work for culture studies, this philosophical approach to language, to thinking, to ways of formulating ideas about the mind, the language of representation, and the world? The first thing one needs to know about post-structuralism is that it's against essentialisms of any kind. It resists the rigidifying of meaning, codification, and the limiting of a text and its meaning processes. In other words, post-structuralism believes in the open-ended nature of texts, that meaning floats freely, that meaning does not rest in a particular center, logical formation or text, and that meaning depends on the interaction of the reader with a specific text. It is context bound. This makes post-structuralism one of the most anti-foundationalist philosophical thoughts in human history. The human itself, for instance, is something that post-structuralism will question and disturb, as we shall see. The key focus for post-structuralism here is the question of how meaning is made. Drawing upon the work of the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, writing in the early part of the 20th century, post-structuralism argues that language is inherently unstable. What do we mean by this? Saussure argued that the link between the word and the concept is arbitrary. For example, the word cat or the word bat does not in any way capture the animal or the piece of wood. But because over a period of time, we have used the words, we have associated the word with the thing, with the object. But the word in no way describes the object. It is we who have established by convention that the word C-A-T means this furry animal. Like our system of traffic signals. Where does it say that red means stop or green means go? It doesn't say anywhere. The color red has nothing to do with the act of stopping your vehicle here. And green does not say that you'll go further. It means by social conventions, we have all collectively accepted that red means stop, that green means go. What Saussure was pointing to was a very interesting phenomenon, that meaning does not rest in the word. Meaning rests in the way we read the word, the way we interpret it, the way we interact with it. Meaning is not inherent in any word or sign. Meaning is a result of a process of making meaning. The crucial part here is to understand what the implications are. If we say words don't carry meanings in themselves, then the next question is, then how do we understand any word? Saussure would say, we understand a word because it's different from another word. Now, what do we mean by this? The word cat makes sense because it is not the word bat. It is not the word hat. That is, the word cat makes sense to us because it's distinctive from another word. It is not the same as another word. You extend this point, I am me because I am not somebody else. I am not my father, I am not my neighbor, I am not my son, I am not my friend. I am me because I am not. All meaning rests upon difference. And this relationship of difference is at the heart of deconstruction and post-structuralist thought. Meaning is not the product of one text, one poem, one word, one sign. It is a product of our reading a system of words. And we say, this is a cat. I understand why? Because the word this, the word is, the word a, the word cat does not look like that is a house. So if you take those two sentences, this is a cat and that is a house, they're different sentences. How do we know? Because they are not the same. All meaning rests upon difference, not similarity. I am me because I'm not somebody else. You are you because you're not somebody else. This emphasis on language as a system of difference is at the heart of what we have come to know as deconstruction, the philosophical school of thought inaugurated by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, writing in the 1960s and made available in English translation from the mid-1976. This interpretation of language decenters the text. When we say decenters the text, what do we mean? We mean effectively the text doesn't have a central core meaning. You can't ask what does a poem mean, what does a film mean. We can't ask that question because the meaning of a particular poem or a particular text or a particular film often comes from outside that, outside the frame of that. For example, when you watch a Hindi film or a Hollywood disaster film, we know this happens and this happens because the meaning comes from outside the text as well. Our text, this film, think of an example, disaster films. How do we know this is a disaster film? Because it has echoes of other disaster films. We understand this is a disaster because we have the idea in our head that the following things mean disaster. Meaning does not rest in this film or in that film. It rests in the relations across films. What does that mean? We decenter a text effectively when we see the meaning as not restricted to a text, to a word or an image. The decentering of a text is the opening out of a text to plural meanings, to multiple interpretations. What the Russian language philosopher Bakhtin would call heteroglossia, many voices. And we say, oh, I have seen this somewhere. Let me give you another example. When you go as a tourist to some place, you see something. But you never see it for the first time. Why? Because you have read about it, you have seen a picture of it, somebody has told you about it. You already go with a preconceived notion in your head that this is what it is. We never visit a place for the first time because we have already visited it in some other form. In some form, we have seen, how many of you have seen the Eiffel Tower, but you all recognize the Eiffel Tower. How? Because you've seen films around the Eiffel Tower. You've seen the River Thames or Big Ben because you've seen it in various forms. So how can you say that I saw the river for the first time? I saw the ocean for the first time here. You have decentered a text. You have decentered a text because you have immediately discovered via post-structuralism that your knowledge of this depends on something else, not on this text. My reading of this text depends on some other text. Let me take our current interactive example. You understand what I am saying because the language in which I am speaking has already been with you. You understand this guy is speaking on camera. I assume there is somebody else on the other side listening to me. If I assume that I'm addressing cats, do you think I'll be speaking like this? No. My language is preset, predetermined, like your anticipation of what I say is predetermined. It decenters this equation, I speak, you listen, because we are both aware of the fact that this is context specific. This is specific to how an institutional mechanism delivers my content to you as an audience. The decentering of a text into a system of relations, of traces of other texts, is a very important, some people say anarchic way of thinking. So suppose people ask, but what is the definite meaning of a text? Post-structuralism would say, the question doesn't arise because there is no such thing as a definite meaning. This meaning that you assume is definite, you will discover echoes something else. So suppose we say, oh, I understand this film because it is this, this and this. You say all that because you have prior knowledge of something else before this film. You have anticipated this meaning because you came prepared with some other films, because that textual unconscious is already at the back of your mind when you read it. Language precedes existence. Language precedes all of us. This leads to some peculiar questions and for some people problems. If we say language precedes us, this means we have no access to something called true knowledge. All knowledge is always already mediated. And we agree that this table means this mic means this, because we have constructed a meaning around it. In the social construction model of knowledge and reality, it's assumed that languages and discourses are a way of talking, scientific discourse, medical discourse, commonplace discourse, joke as discourse, they are forms of speaking, constructs reality for us. Remember what I gave you as an example. You assume I'm here to deliver content. I assume that I'm not addressing cats. Why do you assume that? Because I do not think this program is meant for cats. It's my assumption. You do not think that somebody who is not an academic will be delivering this talk. So we have both been constructed into this relation because of a discourse called the university system, academics, or teaching. Teaching assumes two things. There is a teacher, there is a student. The reality of the teacher and the student is because they are both participating in a discourse, in a construction called teaching. Do you think a teacher is a teacher if there are no students or when they are not teaching? No. When is a student a student? When they are studying. Otherwise, they are not students. This idea of teacher and student doing what they are doing depends upon a discourse called teaching or the classroom or an institutional apparatus where one person speaks, other people listen. They write notes, this one reads from notes. They set assignments, these people write assignments. There's a social construction of our reality via language, via discourse. You must have realized by now that deconstruction relies heavily upon the study of language, the study of linguistic operations. Now, please understand, we are not talking formal analysis of syntax and morphology alone. We are speaking about language as discourse. Discourse is a way of talking. It's a way of speaking. Discourse is a set of parameters that allows you to say certain things and not other things. Let's take an example. Would you write a letter to your principal saying, "Hello there"? Why would you not? Because the discourse of formal letter writing, which we learn at school, says you cannot address your official superior saying, "Hi." You say that to your friend. But you do not address your friend every day as Mr. So-and-so. Why not? Because in an informal interaction, in a non-official interaction, vernacular interaction, we don't use titles, Mr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so, no. But in formal communication, I cannot write to the Vice Chancellor saying, "Hi, Vice Chancellor." Why not? Because a formal letter in an official context has to have a certain system of language operations. That's what we understand as discourse. You may have read a legal document. Do you make sense of it? No. Why not? Because we are not part of the discursive universe in which the language operates in a particular way. The language of the college canteen is not the language of the official letter. Now, I speak the language of the official letter when I write a letter. I will look idiotic if I use it in the canteen. You can't. You can't use it because the discursive universe is different. Now, what we need to understand is discourse is also about power, because when you address your superior, you address in a certain way that emphasizes the power differential. That tells us, no, you're writing to your superior officer, so you cannot use these kinds of words. This kind of language is unacceptable. Discourse constructs us. It puts us into a frame as certain subjects, whether it's gender, class, caste, profession, identities, whether it's national, racial, or ethnic. Discourse is where we fit in. This idea of power, discourse, and identity was elaborated by several post-structuralist thinkers. Two prominent ones which we will talk about briefly would be Michel Foucault and Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan was a psychoanalyst who in the 50s, 60s, and 70s marked a return to Freud. That's not the subject of our discussion here. Lacan argued that identity formation takes place in 3 stages. The child first assumes that whatever he sees of himself is his identity. He looks into the mirror and he realizes for the first time, oh, this is what I look like. I look at this figure and I assume this is real. This is me. This is the mirror stage. But this is still not identity. Then he realizes that his mother and father are 2 different people. They are called different names, they look different, they behave differently. And he is told, you are their child. The boy suddenly discovers that they are separate people, separate beings. I am not them. This is the symbolic order. In the symbolic order, Lacan argues, we enter the language, we enter discourse. We are given names, we are given the names of our parents, our family members, and all of those. Those are mechanics of classifying us, of bestowing identity upon us. So those roles, names, pre-exist us. And suddenly we are told, by the way, you are X's son, Y's daughter. And you as a child begin to discover the world is a system of relations. I am not X, I am not Y, I am not that person, I am the son of, daughter of. Go back to what I have already said. Cat makes sense because it's different from bat. I make sense because I'm different from my mother or my father. But I can only describe myself as different from. In other words, what we are looking at is, if cat makes sense because it's different from bat, I make sense because I'm different from my parents. All identity rests on difference in the symbolic order. Lacan's major contribution to post-structuralism was to argue that all of our processes of identity are structured like a language. In Lacan's famous description, the unconscious is structured like a language. What we are looking at here, therefore, is a system of relations which are about language, culture, identities, and everything else. It's a series. Lacanian psychoanalysis takes us back to the question of discourse by proposing that there is no identity outside the formation of language, outside the process of difference structured like a language. So when we say working class, woman, child, we are immediately saying working class as different from the owner class, woman as different from the man, child as different from the adult. Now when we say child, how do we understand a child? Oh, the child is somebody who is not an adult. This brings us to the heart of deconstructive practice. What do we mean when we say the child is not an adult? We have created a binary, a dualism, child and adult, 2 units, shall we say, two names, shall we say. This is the child, this is the adult. And we say when we talk about children, we should not talk about adults. But you see, you cannot talk about children other than as separate from adults. In other words, you can only speak about the child by implicitly invoking their difference from adults. You say, the child is one who is not an adult. The minute you say that, this binary opposition between child and adult breaks down. You cannot have one without the other. Let me ask a simple question. How do you define darkness? Darkness is black. Darkness is the absence of light. Now you see, you cannot define darkness without defining light. Let's take another common example. What is the inside of your house? You say, well, the inside of my house has all these things. Okay. What else does it not have? Well, it doesn't have the vehicle outside. You cannot define the inside until you define what is outside it. All language operations depend on this binary opposition, inside, outside, up, down, below, upper, child, adult. But deconstruction argues that they are not opposites, they are paired. They are paired because each one needs the other. Each one depends on the other. You cannot define dark except as the absence of light. You cannot define the inside without talking about the outside. Likewise, you cannot define the child without defining the adult. Effectively, this means they participate in each other's identities. They are in dialogue with each other. You cannot speak of identity except in terms of what they are different from. This leads us to a very peculiar situation. Suppose we were to say that light is supreme and dark is inferior. You can only define light in contrast with dark, right? You can only say light is bright and the absence of darkness. Don't you think then that the definition of light depends on the definition of darkness? It does. Then how can you say light is superior? You cannot say that light is superior because even to explain light, you need darkness. To explain an adult, you need a child. To explain a child, you need an adult. Post-structuralism works with this mutuality of structures, of mutual dependency, and therefore an ambivalence of things. You cannot be certain about child because you have to talk about an adult. You cannot be certain about light because you implicitly invoke darkness. What post-structuralism does is therefore to rely on a destabilized, unstable, uneasy language in order to speak about cultural practices. It becomes difficult, I accept this, as a process of meaning making because you don't get a sense of the total. You only get these sharp movements. But post-structuralism argues that those movements prevent dogmatism. They prevent anything from being established as irreducible truth. For cultural studies, this becomes important because cultural studies looks at meaning as a constant state of negotiation, as argument, as battling for space. So if cultural studies is looking at the superiority of the classics versus the inferiority of mass cultural forms, cultural studies will borrow from post-structuralism to say, that's because the classics depend on the mass cultural forms. If we have said popular culture is here and high culture is here, you can only define high culture in contrast to low culture or mass culture, which means this is dependent on this. This insight in cultural studies, this key component of cultural studies comes from post-structuralist thought, where all binaries are reversed. So if we say high culture is superior, deconstructive cultural studies will say, but you cannot prove that unless you talk about mass culture. So post-structuralism's emphasis on reversing binaries, of inverting power relations, spills into cultural studies because cultural studies looks at power. And if we say high culture is dominant and in a position of power, that's because it's dependent on the mass cultural form. Post-structuralism's emphasis on destabilizing centers also means for a larger political project something very crucial. It argues that whatever we have accepted as tradition, as conventions, as norms, are the result of a system of practices of power, of linguistic and representational strategies, which also means that when deconstruction destabilizes language, it calls upon us to destabilize established ways of thinking, of conventions. You cannot speak about fixed meaning in any system of representation, in any cultural practice, because deconstruction tells you immediately, but that is dependent on something else. In literature, for example, if we say, the epic was a great mode of writing. Why? Because it was the following. But deconstructive reading of the history of the genre will tell us that the epic became the way it was because it depended upon certain other forms of storytelling. So the grand epic narrative is made up of smaller oral narratives. The minute you say that, our re-evaluation of the epic mode begins. Deconstruction helps us to break down these so-called established, firm, clear-cut histories. This occurs across languages. It occurs in anthropology, it occurs in archaeology, history, and all of those. And it says, unless we pay attention to how language operates, and that's what deconstruction refers to as its self-reflexive mode, we will assume these truths are established. The most significant philosophical point that comes out of this, and this is not really connected to culture studies, is there is no definite truth. Truth is a mechanism that evolves in certain ways depending on certain power relations to suit certain interests. Truth is the result and the effect of a language operation. It is not built into any word. It's not built into a sentence. It operates this way because certain social structures work. Let's go back to the example I gave you. Why would I not address my Vice Chancellor informally? It's not truth. It's a system of conventions that have determined how you will address your superior officer. By superior, I'm not referring to his moral virtue. Superior, I'm referring again to an institutional mechanism, a hierarchy. Superior does not make them gods. Superior makes them more powerful economically, politically, or whatever, or administratively. This is a system of conventions, of institutionalized distinctions. This is what deconstruction tells us. Deconstruction tells us that these positions, these names, these nomenclatural structures are actually hinging upon difference. And deconstruction tells us truth is not inherent in any of these. Truth is based on our negotiation of these across a period of time and which are institutionally approved. Let me summarize what I have said, starting from the question of language. Language is inherently unstable. That's the first thing you have to understand. Language relies on a system of difference, of cat being different from bat, me being different from you being different from somebody else. Deconstruction and post-structuralism destabilizes this language and extends it into questions of culture for our purposes by saying all so-called dominant aspects of culture, of the binary equation, rely upon the lower ones. For culture studies, this becomes important because the practices of culture which we have been looking at, whether it's IPL or films, have a certain dominant mode. But post-structuralism tells us this dominant mode is itself unstable because it relies on something else. For us to understand this, you need to think in terms of how we constantly oppose one to another. Like I gave you the example, you can only talk about children as distinct from adults. Our knowledge of cultural practices in terms of hegemony or ideology or power relations makes us pay attention to how these relations are being built. This brings us to the final point, actually, that since we are part of this discursive universe, our identities are dependent upon a linguistic operation, on me being different from you, of me being not the same as somebody else. Deconstruction destabilizes all identity and says identity is the effect of a system of representation, of language itself.